Hello and welcome to the Journal Paper Writing Club Week 7 Peer Review. And in this video I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the peer review process and how it works and why it exists. I'm going to share some tips on how to review a paper if you're ever asked to take part in the peer review process, and how to respond to reviewers' comments once you have submitted a manuscript for peer review. So let's get started. So what is peer review? In a nutshell, peer review exists to subject an author's scholarly work, research or ideas to the scrutiny of others who are experts in the same field. Within the publishing sector, this is normally done to make sure that the work meets the accepted high standards and is a control mechanism. However, it can be quite slow, and as you might have maybe come across already, it doesn't always catch everything. And there's always a continuous discussion how to improve the peer review process. However, what you can do is to make sure that your reviews are done thoroughly. And if you do see something, please report it. The two main purposes for peer review for publications is to act as a filter, that is to filter out kind of research that wasn't done properly, or maybe bad writing, bad structure, these kind of things, for example, or misleading research, all of those things. But it's also there to improve the quality of the submitted manuscripts, maybe through editing, through suggestions, but also by asking questions or asking for clarification. So keep this in mind when you're reviewing a paper or when you get comments back on your paper. The idea is to make the manuscript better. And remember, editing is part of the writing process, and in this case, some of the editing is done by someone else. So let's talk about the peer review process. What happens once you have submitted your manuscript? So depending on the journal, it is normally reviewed by an editor or an assistant editor, for example, and they do a first screening of the manuscript. After this first screening by an editor, there are two options. One is called a desk rejection, and that normally happens if you've picked the wrong journal, or in your cover letter you didn't quite explain well enough why your paper should be submitted or published by this journal. The other outcome is that the editor accepts your manuscript and will send it for review. As I said already, not all journals will have an editor, but most of them now do have some sort of editorial process in place to help with this initial filtering of manuscripts. Depending on the journal you've submitted to, there are different types of review. The first one is double anonymous, where the reviewers don't know the author and the author doesn't know the reviewers. Then there's the single anonymous option, where the reviewers know the author but the author doesn't know who reviewed their work. Or there's the fully open review, where everything is published, even the correspondence. And a lot of new journals, especially voluntary run or kind of society-based journals, will run this kind of open process. And the idea is that once this process is open, it is fairer and also it is more constructive. Once your manuscript has been reviewed in whatever format the journal prefers, there are three outcomes. It could be a rejection, a resubmit, or an accept. So what do you do depending on the outcome of your review? If it is a rejection, it is highly likely that you just picked the wrong journal. It wasn't quite the right fit. So it's definitely worthwhile having a look at reviewer comments if you're getting them, why it was rejected, and then maybe going for another journal. It could be the quality of your writing and maybe it just wasn't up to standard. Or maybe there was a misunderstanding between your manuscript and the journal, maybe the reviewers, for example. And again, this could be down to your writing. So if this happens to you, don't be disheartened. Have a look at the reviewers' comments, make a decision why it was rejected and how to rectify this rejection. Maybe it needs more work, or maybe it just can go to another journal. If you get asked to resubmit or revise and resubmit your manuscript, there are two options. One is that it's just minor corrections and that the editor will be able to just check if you have done those revisions and it'll go to publication. Or it could be that it might need more work. So it might be revised, resubmit and peer review. So this tends to be when major revisions are needed, and that just means that you will probably have to spend a little bit more work on the manuscript, and then the reviewers, and ideally it is the same ones, will be able to review the manuscript in its amended form, and then they make a decision if basically your corrections meet the criteria and if you've done the work that they have asked you to do. And if your manuscript has been accepted, that is fantastic. Make sure you keep the final author version for self-archiving. This is important, especially if you might have selected a journal that is not open access. But if you check on the Sherpa website, you might be able to find out if and what version you can self-archive. So make sure you do keep that final author version for yourself, and by that I mean the version that you last had editorial control over. That tends to be the Word document before it gets typeset for the journal. So what things should you consider if you are ever being asked to review a paper? First up, be professional. You want to take part in peer review. You can maybe ask supervisors or colleagues if they're being asked to review, maybe they can't take that on. You can have a look out on social media. Sometimes people are looking on social media for reviewers. For example, I myself came across someone yesterday who asked if someone would like to review a paper that was about writing or teaching engineers how to write. And I'm now reviewing that paper, so it's always worth having an eye out for that. Or if there are certain journals you think might be relevant, where you could, add your expertise, you can always get in touch. Journals are always looking for peer reviewers as well, and you can get your name added to the database. Make sure you don't obviously overcommit. This is unfortunately still a voluntary part of the whole publishing process. But do make sure that you take part in the peer review process as well. Normally you will be invited via an email once you are on a system, for example. So even if you've come across this by word of mouth or through social media, for example, you will normally receive some form of email invitation. You might have to log on to a system, and on that system you can then accept or reject the review. Make sure you do check on the timelines. Some journals have faster turnaround times than others, and make sure that you keep your other commitments in mind when accepting a review, for example. Once you have done that, you've been asked to review and if you've accepted a review, the next things are more about the actual review process. So the first one, make sure that your review is helpful. You want to improve the manuscript. You want to make sure that the next reader or all the other readers, once it's published, have the best manuscript in front of them that it could be. So you want to provide suggestions, and you want to maybe ask questions if you're not sure about something. Maybe there's something that needs to be clarified. Maybe something is just not in the right order, or the structure doesn't make sense. Maybe there's too much information in the paper as well. Obviously, whoever writes that manuscript, and maybe you're in that position as well, obviously you're so involved in your work, you want to share everything, but sometimes for a journal paper that can be too much. So you could suggest that certain parts might go into an appendix or supplementary materials, for example. So always keep in mind, what can you do to make this manuscript better? Make sure you are scientific, and by that I mean, that you focus on adding value to the scientific knowledge, or that the manuscript you are reviewing is adding value to, our wider knowledge, as well as the knowledge of that research area, but also that the research has been done in an appropriate manner. That will depend obviously on the research topic. If you're not sure about something, a methodology, you can always ask for clarification, for example, and you can maybe also check with other work, for example, that mentions maybe similar things. You can check some of the references as well. Make sure that you are timely. As I said already, different journals will have different timescales for their reviews, and do try and stick to those deadlines. If for whatever reason you need an extension, obviously you can always get in touch with the journal and ask for that, and they'll be more than happy to provide that. But make sure you don't ask kind of on the day of the deadline. If you can ask a few days in advance or a little bit before that, as well, that shouldn't really be an issue. When reviewing the manuscript, keep in mind that this is someone's work, and they might not be able to do all of the things you are suggesting. So be realistic. Be realistic about the context the work is presented in. Be realistic about suggested changes. If you want to suggest someone goes off and does another 3 months of experiments, depending on the position that person's in, that might not be possible. They might maybe no longer be working in that institution. They might have moved on, or maybe, obviously financially, maybe there's just not the money available. However, if some of the things need to be done and can be done realistically, then maybe ask for that. However, keep that in mind, that obviously time and finances are valid reasons that some of the work might have not been done or might not be possible to do now. Be empathetic. Make sure there is another person, at the end of your review. Keep that in mind. If you are in a bad mood, maybe don't write your review comments at that time. Make sure that you are, helpful and courteous, and also, sensitive and respectful. So even if there is something that requires, major work, or maybe something needs major revisions, make sure you explain why that is, and that is to help make the manuscript better. There's nothing worse for the person who gets that review to read something that just makes them feel bad about themselves. So make sure you do put your comments in context as well. And from that, basically, don't be rude. Don't be reviewer too. We hear so much about. And one of the things as well, make sure when you do comment on certain things that you don't let your biases get in the way. For example, don't ever suggest someone needs a native English speaker to check the manuscript. That is just wrong on a lot of levels, and just because something might have not been written in the way you might want to, you're used to, or the standard you would have expect, doesn't mean it was written by a non-native speaker at all. If you want someone to check or get the manuscript checked for spelling and grammar, say so. It has nothing to do with the experience or the level of English of the authors. So basically, don't step into that. It's perfectly fine to say this manuscript could benefit from a thorough grammatical and spelling check before it is resubmitted. And just stay away assuming that someone isn't a native English speaker, for example. Depending on the journal you are reviewing for, you might not be a topic expert on everything they're writing about, and it's okay to say so. You might want to have an opening sentence, or even to the editor when they ask you and being like, yes, okay, I can, my expertise in this is in this area, and I can comment on these things, but I'm not too sure about some of the other aspects, and hopefully that's covered by one of the other reviewers, for example. That doesn't mean that you can't review the paper. It might actually be quite interesting for the person who wrote the manuscript to get that other viewpoint as well. But make sure you keep that in your own limitations in a way. Keep that in mind as well. And you can add that to your reviewer report if you want to share that with the authors, or you can just share that in a report that only goes to the editors, for example. Make sure that you or yourself are organized when it comes to your review, and make sure that you do make your review easy to follow, and also proofread your own review before you submit it as well. So here are a few things you want to keep in mind when collating your reviewer comments or your review report, whatever the journal calls it. You want to give an overview of the proposed kind of improvements or changes, and that could just be kind of a general paragraph maybe on how much, just so the author knows maybe how much is coming. You do want to feedback on the paper structure and the order, if things make sense or made sense to you. Maybe something needs to be reworded or explained more clearly, for example. You want to give a comment around the quality of data sources, maybe their methods, the logical flow of any arguments, and the validity of the conclusions. And it's always nice in a review report to always comment on good things. It's not just there to say this is, this needs to be improved and this needs to be improved. If something was well written or was well explained, you can say that as well. Make sure you also feedback on style and voice of writing, but again, keep in mind all your suggestions should be there to improve the manuscript. Ideally, you will then refer to line numbers that will ideally be provided in the manuscript, and then you can go and say specific things that you would like to have changed. And ideally, you want to just do that in the order of the line numbers. So you just go, okay, line number 5 to 10, change this, give what the text is to this. And then just makes it easier for the person who has to then do the changes to go through them basically step by step and check them. As with everything else, obviously practice makes perfect, and also you will become faster at the review process as well, and there will be certain things that you will just be able to pick up a little bit more easily. There is a great organization called Sense About Science, and I will link to them in the comment section or in the description of this video. And they do run peer review workshops, and I highly recommend you have a look on their website to see when the next ones are coming up. You can always ask a peer or your supervisor to have a look over your reviewer comments and reports as well if you want to, or if it's your first one, maybe you want to let the editor know this is your first review, they can check something. My experience is if this is your first, the first review or the first few reviews, you will probably do a very thorough job, and whoever gets to see your review will get a very detailed report, and the more you do it, the less and less that probably happens, unless you kind of come up with your own system. There are a couple of guides available online as well, and I'll make sure I include the links below as well. So there are a couple of blog posts, for example, and some templates that you might want to use as well. Okay, so similarly to the overview summary, when you write a review report, you might want to give a summary of the changes you have made. So for example, did you do all of the changes, or did you do certain aspects of the changes? That's just to help the editor or the reviewer to know or to remind themselves what they ask you to do, and also that just gives an idea of how much of the changes you did, for example. Always be polite and respectful. That isn't always easy, and I'm sure you have heard lots of stories, particularly about reviewer 2. So try and stay away from that. Remember, there is a person on the other end of your review, or in that sense, basically take the high road because they might have forgotten that this goes to a person, so you don't want to be, replying back in the same manner. If you do feel strongly about something, maybe write it out, just don't send that part. Go back the next day or a few days later and try and be as polite as you can be in your response to the reviewer's comments. Sometimes that can not be possible, and there might be a review where you don't really know what to say. So for example, for one of my manuscripts, one of the reviewers wrote back saying that this is so bad, they're not going to basically waste time reviewing it. That's all they said. I'm not sure how the editor let that go past them directly to me, because obviously that didn't really help anybody. But that can happen, so you just have to brush that aside, and hopefully reviewer 1 and 3 will be helpful. The next one can also be a little bit difficult, but you have to accept the blame. If someone didn't understand what you're trying to say, if someone says this doesn't make sense, unfortunately it might have to do with your writing. Obviously, if something is, like a silly misunderstanding in the way or something like that, then, so you don't have to accept the blame for that. But you can't really say, you understood that wrong, this is what I meant, because if they didn't get that from your writing, then unfortunately it is your writing that has to change in that instance. Make sure when you do respond to the changes you have made that these are self-contained. So you want to quote the change directly. Ideally, you can refer back to the line numbers from the original revised version, for example, or maybe the reviewer labeled the changes. I know sometimes people maybe create a little table to see how they've changed things, or maybe you submit track changes, so that might be a little bit on your preference as well. You want to respond to every point that was raised. Sometimes that can be a bit tricky, especially when different reviewers ask you different things and someone said that's fine and someone says it isn't, or they want you to change things slightly differently. Then you as the author need to make a judgment call. And also keep in mind, you don't have to do all of the changes that are being suggested. If you have a good reason to not change something, you can say so. And then the editor or the reviewer will have to basically think about your comments and then make a decision based on that. So just because someone tells you to do something doesn't mean you have to, but you need to address it in your comments back. On top of the, maybe a table or something like that, you can also use typography to help the reviewers navigate your responses. So for example, you could have something in italic, maybe you want to change, maybe you want to show changes in bold, for example. Try not to use color, but you can use different kind of styles of typeface for that, for example. Where possible, give a straight answer. So, yes, no. When the reviewer is correct, also let them know and make sure you do thank them for the review and for pointing something out, for example. And where possible, do what they ask you to do. But obviously, as I said before, if there's something that you really don't want to do and you don't think is quite the right thing to do, you don't have to do it as well, but you have to comment to say why you didn't do that change, for example. And make sure you are clear about what has changed to the previous version, so with the self-contained response, but you might also want to submit track changes. There's also a compare function in Word, for example, but ideally the reviewers would kind of see where you have done the changes within the manuscript as well. And with everything else, as part of the review process, stay polite and try and remember that there are, people behind the manuscripts, behind the reviews, and behind the review comments. And hopefully this will help you get ready for your first review, or if you have reviewed before, maybe you want to make some changes to how you review papers, or maybe how you deal with reviewers' comments as well. And that's it. Thank you for watching the Journal Paper Writing Club peer review video. If you enjoyed this video, have a look on my website where I have other videos available, mostly relating to writing, but I'm working on other resources as well. Please have a look on my website for more information.